Coming up on the Civil Discourse, veteran New York Times journalist Stephen Greenhouse reports on the evolution of the workplace and labor movement in the United States and abroad. He's the author of the books Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor, and The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker.
So there's a lot of excitement about unions, and there's an effort, but they're hitting a wall because Starbucks and Amazon are fighting so hard against it. And it's hard to win when your employer is fighting in 15 different ways to basically crush and cripple the unionization drive.
Hello and welcome to the Civil Discourse. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, professor of English and dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University, speaking to you from my office at Bentley Hall in Philadelphia. Today, my guest is Stephen Greenhouse, an award-winning reporter for the New York Times for 31 years, some 20 of which he spent covering labor and workplace issues. Mr. Greenhouse is also the author, most recently, of Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Stephen Greenhouse, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Great to be here, Paula.
You have both a journalism and a law degree, and I wonder if your initial goal was to be a lawyer or whether you felt that law would be helpful to you for a journalistic career. So tell us about that.
I was long torn between being a journalist and being a lawyer. I guess when I went to college initially, I thought I'd try to be a lawyer, but then I became editor of my college newspaper at Wesleyan, and I loved being a journalist. You know, after college, I worked for years as a lackey as a copy boy at the New York Times, literally fetching coffee and sorting mail. And after a year there, I applied to both NYU Law School and Columbia Journalism School. I got into the Columbia Graduate School. I got into both, and I decided to go to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Then I worked in journalism for a few years at a newspaper in New Jersey. I wasn't terribly happy there, and I said, I should prepare for another profession. And I went to law school, NYU Law School. But in law school, I realized that it's funner and more interesting being a journalist than being a lawyer. So I figured if I could get really lucky and get offered a job at the New York Times or the Washington Post, I'd be happy to be a journalist. And an editor I knew at the New York Times who liked me when I was a boy lackey offered me a job to be a reporter. And 31 years later, I did not regret it.
That makes sense. And certainly there's a lot of excitement that can happen in journalism. I know that the New York Times, which you got to relatively early in your career, sometimes it takes people quite a long time, is considered the pinnacle of a journalistic achievement. And it must have been exhilarating for you to land that job and to be there for 30 years. Doors open for New York Times journalists and people respect you. But I imagine there might be some roadblocks and some intimidation that comes with being a Times journalist. Did you find that? What are the pros and cons of working for that paper?
You can explore issues that really interest you, and every day you're there trying to do your very best work, and you and everyone else you're working with is trying to put out the very best news report and newspaper in the world day after day, and that is exhilarating. And you're working with some terrific people, and you learn from a lot of terrific people. The main downside was the pay wasn't very good. The people I went to law school with were all making 2, 3, 4 times. We're generally making 2, 3, 4 times what I was earning, but I loved my work.
Well, I can't think of anything better than being in the New York Times Paris bureau, especially since you and your wife speak French, I believe.
Yes.
So
yes.
That must have been wonderful. But you're a unionized shop, so that has something to do with your pay being not as high as others.
It was, just the field, going back, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, journalists were just paid much less than equally educated, equally intelligent people. And I used to joke that the New York Times probably had the highest ratio of IQ to pay of, virtually any employer in the country. Fortunately, pay in journalism has at the elite papers has risen recently, and that's good to try to because they realize they have to be more competitive in the market.
So, what do you say to people who argue that the New York Times and some other papers, but the Times has been targeted, has abandoned neutrality and now tilts too far to the left?
I think that is a myth that the folks on the right have been propagating, disseminating for decades. I think it really started, under the George W. Bush administration when they really, pushing for the Iraq War and really didn't want anyone in Congress, didn't want anyone in the business community, and certainly didn't anyone in the media criticizing them and questioning their foolish decision to go to war in Iraq. Many Republicans, led by Donald Trump, don't want the media questioning, their many, I'll say untruths or lies, a word I don't like to use, but like that vaccines don't work, that cutting taxes actually raises revenues. I think, unfortunately and sadly, many Republicans are telling far too many untruths, and the media challenges them and corrects them, and like they don't want to be challenged. So the way they respond is saying the media is lying, the media is a tool of the left.
Would you say that some standards in journalism have shifted a bit in the last few decades? There is some editorializing that happens, it seems to me, in news articles, which in the past would have been anathema.
I would question that. I would welcome you to point that out. I mean, some people say, well, the New York Times, after wrestling with the issue for several years, finally said, okay, we can call what Donald Trump says lies. And for several years, they didn't want to do that because they were worried that would seem partisan. They would avoid ever saying anyone ever lied. But like Donald Trump, day after day, week after week, month after month, tells many untruths. And they're deliberate and he knows better, but he still does it. So,
well, let's move on because, when we focus on Trump, we get rather, bogged down. But I was thinking more generally, but I want to get to your involvement with labor. I wonder when you were assigned the labor beat and if this was something you sought or whether it was simply handed to you. And I know at the New York Times, people are given things that are not necessarily originally in their bailiwick. Isn't that right?
I was first hired at the New York Times in fall of 1983, and my initial beat was covering the steel industry and basic industry in the United States, the lumber industry, the aluminum industry. And this editor, whom I loved, asked me, what do I ultimately want to do with the New York Times? And here I was about 35 years old, and I said, I'd be really interested in the labor beat. And he thought I was crazy. He thought that's such an unsexy beat that, I'm such a talented guy. Why don't I want to cover the White House or be London bureau or Paris bureau chief? So I was long interested in labor. So I'd been in the Paris bureau for 5 years. Then I was in the Washington bureau for 4 years, first covering the economy for 2 years and then covering the State Department of foreign policy. And covering the State Department, I was working my derriere off day after day. And I missed, I liked the beat, but I missed writing about human beings. I missed writing about flesh and blood. So the labor beat was open and I raised my hand. I threw my hat into the ring and I was chosen to be labor reporter. And I thought, I'd just do it 3, 4, 5 years the way reporters generally, the tenure that most reporters have for a beat. But I did it for 19 years. And I used to joke that if I had done a really great job, they would have promoted me to be a White House reporter or something. Or if I'd done a really lousy job, they would have kicked me off the beat. But I think the fact that I was on it for 19 years probably meant that they thought I was doing quite a good job.
Yeah. No, that's interesting about the flesh and blood aspect that you wanted and that labor gave you.
And one of the reasons I wanted the labor beat is, I wanted to write about human beings, but it's a very rich beat because you could write about, policy. You could write profiles of interesting people. You could write about the plight of, farm workers, who aren't making enough to live on. You could write about safety issues, people dying on a job. There was a tremendous range. Yes.
Yeah. But I wonder if you could define labor for us. I mean, to me, there's a class element immediately involved when we say labor. And I find it a bit confusing nowadays when it would seem to me that some managers are exploited and I guess don't fall within the labor category. Is labor mostly blue collar? I'm wearing my blue collar here. Or how do you define it?
When I first, applied for the labor beat, one of my best friends, said, Steve, you've been in Paris, you've been in Washington, you don't want this beat. It's a drab beat. It's not very sexy. I said, there are 140, 150 million workers in the United States. If I can't find a ton of good stories to write about, it wasn't just unions, it was about, struggling farm workers, about workers who work 70 hours a week. So how do you define labor? I defined it very broadly, as not just, McDonald's workers struggling to make a living on $8 an hour, but Goldman Sachs workers who worked 100, 110 hours a week, or young lawyers who are working 80, 90, 100 hours a week at the law firm, and how, their labor was, how they felt exploited as laborers, and many, many things in between. I read about the Steelworkers Union and their contract talks and the New York City subway strike. And I wrote about, sweatshop conditions in Bangladesh and in Honduras, and the horrible, horrific, tragic fires in Bangladesh that killed hundreds of workers. And then increasingly, Paula, there are the issues of artificial intelligence and robots.
How fascinating. I mean, really, it's the universe and related matters that you are dealing with here. Your 2008 book, The Big Squeeze, looked at the nature of the workplace, I think, particularly in the realm of corporations. You discussed workers who are being squeezed by management in various ways. Could you just summarize what you felt the aspect of the situation was then and how it is now by comparison? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it the same?
I started the labor beat in late 1995, and then there was the recession in 2001. And then in the years after the recession, I saw that corporate profits kept increasing. I saw that the stock market kept reaching record levels. I saw that productivity, the amount each worker produced per hour on average, were also increasing record levels. But wages after inflation, year after year, were stagnant. And I saw that even as many corporations were having record profits and their stock prices were at record levels, they were reducing health benefits, making workers pay much more for health benefits. They were changing the retirement plans, the pension plans, to worse plans. They were reducing the number of paid sick days, reducing the number of paid vacations. And to my mind, corporations were so focused on maximizing profits and maximizing share price that they were warping things and really squeezing workers way too hard, that workers weren't being treated fairly, that there was this disconnect between how corporations were doing and how the workers who produced their profits were doing. And I wrote this book called The Big Squeeze, saying something is broken in our economy, that corporations, the top 1%, the top 10% were doing very well, thank you, but the bottom 50, 60% weren't doing very well. Now, fast forward to today, we saw a lot of this also during the pandemic, I'm sorry to say. Many corporations faced difficulties, but they still managed to make make record profits. And the stock market, until recently, had soared to record levels. And, workers, their wages were not keeping up with inflation. Many workers were treated, unfortunately, fairly shabbily, quite shabbily during the pandemic. Many weren't given PPE, personal protection equipment. We saw how so many meatpacking workers died on the job. So many here in New York, where I am, so many bus drivers and subway conductors, a ton died on the job. And I think there was a widespread feeling, I think that's fueling a lot of the push for unionization nowadays. I think there's a widespread feeling that something's broken, that corporations are doing very well, CEOs are raising their salaries, but typical workers are just being squeezed and often taken on the chin. We had this crazy situation where the white collar workers who are making $150,000, $200,000 a year are working safely at home during the pandemic. But the frontline workers making $8, $9, $12, $13 an hour, who are at cashiers at supermarkets or at pharmacies or bus drivers, that their pay is hardly going up at all, and they risk their lives day after day. And so people just felt there's something really wrong with the economy and how we're being treated.
So your latest book, the 2019 book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, is a history of labor as well as a sort of ethnography that deals with some profiles, as did your earlier book, looking at the history of labor, where we are now. You mentioned the fact that unionization seems to be revitalized in the current situation, while our situation from the point of view of the disparity between a worker's pay and a CEO's pay is huge, larger than it even was in 2008. So are you hopeful? Do you see that unionization is going to make this better? Are people going to demand more equity? How do you see the future, the next decade, in terms of the labor situation?
I'm moderately hopeful. Just some background. So in the 1950s, essentially 1 in 3, slightly more than 1 in 3 workers in the United States was in a union. And that has slipped to basically 1 in 10 nowadays. And in the private sector, just 1 in 16, just 6%. So there's been a major decline. And there are numerous reasons for that. The number of manufacturing jobs has declined as many factories closed down or moved overseas. Many factory operations have moved from the heavily unionized Midwest and Northeast to the South, where it's far harder to unionize. There's been a boom in service sector jobs, banking, restaurants, nail salons, beauty salons, and those are generally much harder to unionize than auto factories or steel mills. And corporate America, and I argue in my book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, corporate America, U.S. corporations fight far harder against unionization and corporations than any other industrialized nation. They're very, very aggressive in trying to stamp out unions, as we're seeing with Starbucks and Amazon nowadays. So on one hand, there's this very hopeful moment for unions coming directly out of the pandemic, where a lot of workers thought we weren't treated right. We didn't get the raises we should have gotten. We didn't get, we were hailed as essential workers. We were hailed as heroes, but that hasn't shown up in our paycheck. So I think, that's why we're seeing this big push at Amazon, at Starbucks, at Apple, at REI, at Chipotle, more recently at a Home Depot in Philadelphia, the first Home Depot seeking to unionize, and now at a Lowe's also in Louisiana. So there's a lot of excitement about unionizing. The American public is showing more approval towards unions than any time in the past half century. 71% of the American public approves of unions, according to Gallup. Various academic studies show basically that 1 in 2 non-union workers say they would unionize if they could. So there's a lot of excitement about unions, and there's an effort, but they're hitting a wall because Starbucks and Amazon are fighting so hard against it. And it's hard to win when your employer is fighting in 15 different ways to basically crush and cripple the unionization drive.
Well, it is interesting to think about how unions are seen. You say there's a lot of positive regard for unions. I know I come from a union family. My grandparents were union people, garment workers union. My mother was in the teachers union, a high school teacher. She was very involved with helping to get better pay for teachers. But somehow something changed. And the view of the union, at least when I reached middle age, struck me as being one in which the unions had overreached, that there was corruption, and there was a tendency to, there was a sort of illogic to some of the behavior. I mean, I see that here, even in the university, and some of the unionized workers, that sometimes you can't hammer a nail, you can't do this or you can't do that because it's a union job. And I think that does turn people off, that kind of.
Some people call it feather bedding.
Okay, yeah. And it's discouraging for people who want to get things done. And I think Americans want to get things done. And I'll give you another piece to this business of Americans think in terms of individualized, and here at Drexel, our motto is ambition can't wait. So the idea is that every individual can make his or her own way. And they tend to feel, and I guess management plays on the idea that it will thwart individual creativity and ambition.
I certainly don't want to give the impression I think that there aren't problems with unions. I've written, lots about union corruption, and unions unfortunately had a real legacy of discriminating against women and people of color. And yes, unfortunately, some unions and members are like, too persnickety about these tiny, inefficient rules that get in the way of moving forward. And yes, during the 1970s and 80s, when all these auto plants were closing and steel mills were closing, people said that's because wages are way too high and the unions are way too inflexible. And comparatively, auto and steel wages were quite high then. Now they're no longer so high. They've come down a great deal after inflation. And I think a lot of unions have gotten the message that they were seen as too obstructionist, as too intransigent. And there's this whole growth of a union movement called bargaining for the common good, where unions really try to not just selfishly raise their own wages, but try to help the public. And like the statewide teacher strikes we saw in Arizona, West Virginia, and Oklahoma, where the teachers like trying very hard to make schools better, not just get raises, but sometimes class sizes were ridiculously large, and they want to reduce class sizes. In Columbus, they were saying, there's no air conditioning in a lot of schools. There isn't adequate heating in winter. That makes it impossible, very difficult for the kids to learn. In Seattle, a big issue was that there weren't enough aides to help, students who are disabled and help students who need multilingual instruction. And they're trying to push school boards to do a better job to ensure that teaching is done better. The Los Angeles teacher strike, before the strike, they were offered a 6% raise. They settled for a 6% raise, but the important things they won were smaller class sizes, more nurses, more librarians, more school counselors. So I think unions have gotten, somewhat of the message that you were talking about, that you're too obstructionist. You're not worried enough about helping the public.
So there may be a resurgence of unions in a slightly different form. I could foresee it, given the inequity in this country, how, we have really two nations, as Disraeli said in the 19th century about England. But what do you think about Biden's decision to forgive student loans and how that affects labor? Do you think it was a good idea?
So people ask me, why are so many young people so enthusiastic about unions nowadays? And I say, a lot of them finish college owing $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, and rents are astronomical for a lot of them, and they have to live with mommy and daddy, unfortunately, after going to college. And paying back student loans is a huge burden for them. So college costs have really skyrocketed for the younger generation compared to when we were in school. And I think that President Biden is trying to make lives easy for them.
But blue collar workers will have to take the bill for that to some extent. And I think many of them are resentful.
Understandable. So yeah. Biden very much said, I also want to provide free community college to help blue collar families, to help create more mobility for blue collar families. And the other political party has stopped that from happening.
I see.
So he wants to help young people, both those who have problems going to a four-year college, who want to go to community college, and those who, have these huge college debts.
Right. It's just that the government doesn't have unlimited funds.
That is true. And yes, I can understand that the blue collar people and white collar people who busted their butts to pay off their student loans might feel this is unfair. And anything government does often has people say, oh, this is unfair. Why are you giving Medicare to people over 65? Why not also give it to people under 65?
What are your thoughts on a guaranteed income, a minimum income?
On one hand, if you say it's wrong to give a blanket student loan forgiveness because it's helping many people who don't need it, that's the same thing with guaranteed annual income. There'll be people making, $500,000, $1 million a year who would also get guaranteed income. So I generally favor something called an earned income tax credit, which is an income supplement to people who make less than $50,000, $40,000 a year, people who really need it. Now, supporters of a guaranteed income say Americans are against welfare. They're against programs that target the poor because they say you're cosseting the poor, you're discouraging them from working. So let's give an across-the-board income supplement to everybody. Then people can't say you're only giving it to the poor. But, that that one could argue is also wasting a lot of money. It's giving a lot of money to people who don't need it. So I generally would favor increasing the earned income tax credit to the needy workers who make $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, who need more to afford childcare. And one thing we certainly need is to do more to help subsidize childcare, because so many people making less than $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year can hardly afford the $15,000, $20,000 per child it costs for childcare. So that to my mind would be a better use of money than giving guaranteed income across the board to people making $20,000 and $200,000, $2 million a year.
Oh, these are such complicated questions. But I have to say, and we're out of time, that you have spent your life, I think, doing very good work. And you're clearly a very compassionate as well as an astute human being. So I really am pleased to have had a chance to talk to you. And I recommend your books to our readers.
Thanks, and great talking to you. And we share that both our grandfathers were in the Garment Workers Union, and my father was in the Teachers Union. Your mother was. So
yes. Yeah. So that is an interesting parallel there.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank our audience for joining us today on the Civil Discourse.